I'm creating this response video in order to clear up some pretty bad misconceptions around Bostrom's paper, Are You Living in a Simulation? The video I am responding to by Duncan is probably the worst video I have ever seen in regards to Bostrom's paper. It isn't a critical analysis, but a complete misrepresentation. Throughout Duncan's video, it becomes plainly obvious that he has never read Bostrom's paper, despite posting a screenshot of it in the video.
Premise 1. There are many civilizations. Premise 2. These civilizations build computers that can simulate conscious beings. And conclusion, there are many more simulated conscious beings than real ones, so you are likely to live in a simulation. Now here, if you're Joe Rogan brain, or if you're an Elon Musk worshipper, you hear that and you think, that seems pretty straightforward. I guess we probably do live in a simulation.
Disregarding the blatant mocking tone within the clip, it becomes apparent that Duncan either does not understand Bostrom's premises or is taking a clip he heard out of context. Bostrom does bring up the multiple civilizations premise, a premise that veers outside of his paper, in order to help Joe Rogan try and understand his position in a more concise way. However, it is important to note that the premises that Duncan puts forth is not an exact representation of the premises in Bostrom's paper, as it is just another angle to look at with the simulation hypothesis.
10 to the power of
Normal
100.
versus weird, how so? How are you defining?
Well, the normal ones are ones that have evolved on planets and had a mother and
different planets. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, different planets.
Okay, but we only have one planet, right?
Right, but this again is like a... Well, I mean, actually, there are a lot of planets in the universe, and if it's infinite, there's got to be a lot of copies of you, right?
That has life.
Right.
This is pure speculation, right?
Well, but this is a thought experiment, I mean,
right.
which in fact actually probably is matches reality in this respect.
Most likely, there's some other planets out there. Well,
I think the fact that it matches reality is, I think, irrelevant to the point I want to make.
Okay.
But so, if this turned out to be the way the world works, a few weird ones happening from gas clouds, and then the vast majority are just normal people living on a planet, would you similarly say, given that model, that you should think, oh, it might just as well be one of these gas cloud ones, because after all, the other ones might not have happened yet.
Side note, the Joe Rogan brain comment doesn't even make sense here. Joe Rogan was a huge opponent of the position Bostrom was arguing for during the podcast.
There's going to be no evidence that there is, no evidence that it's ever even going to be possible technologically. We think there could be, but it hasn't happened yet. So why would you assume that we are in a simulation currently when there's no evidence whatsoever that it's even possible to create a simulation?
There's a lot to unpack here. For one, Duncan and Bostrom agree on one point, that it is not a simulation theory. As we saw in the clip, Bostrom does not consider it a theory either, rather a thought experiment. The next misconception is about Duncan's premises versus Bostrom's. Bostrom's premises on the paper are as follows. The human species is very likely to go extinct before reaching a post-human stage. Any post-human civilization is extremely unlikely to run a significant number of simulations of their evolutionary history, or variations thereof. We are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. This differs from the premises brought up with the Joe Rogan conversation, as it focuses on sole human ability rather than alien species and their intention as brought up by Duncan. I don't know why Duncan didn't use the actual premises in the paper, rather a side conception by Bostrom, in order to help people who don't understand the initial paper, as it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. I guess because if he did, the entire first half of his video would be pointless. The next misconception: substrate independence. Duncan says this.
The most significant issue has to do with the assumptions that we can simulate conscious experience computationally. This idea assumes substrate independence, which is the notion that consciousness and the mind are not constrained by their physical substrate. Or in other words, that minds can exist in biological systems as well as computational systems. And this idea, too, effectively assumes the philosophical view known as the computational theory of mind. And this is basically the idea that consciousness is reducible to information processing, and therefore that the mind is a kind of computation.
It is strange that what Duncan claims as the most significant issue is addressed by Bostrom in his paper. Either Duncan did not read the paper, or he outright does not understand the content within the paper. In response to the substrate independence hypothesis, Bostrom says, The argument we shall present does not, however, depend on any very strong version of functionalism or computationalism. For example, we need not assume that the thesis of substrate independence is necessarily true, either analytically or metaphysically, just that, in fact, a computer running a suitable program would be conscious. I find it strange that Duncan takes a lot of time tackling a concept that Bostrom brings up only to disregard its relevance to his thought experiment. Bostrom is telling the reader to accept the prerequisite of consciousness or emulated consciousness within technology. This is because the thesis of the paper focuses on statistical likelihood rather than a theory of mind.
But once again, these beliefs are pretty much equivalent with religious, faith-based beliefs in an afterlife. The biggest problem I have with the simulation hypothesis, or this mind-uploading nonsense, is that it shrouds these faith-based opinions under the guise that it is logical, rational, or scientific.
The last misrepresentation I will talk about is when Duncan discusses the simulation thought experiment and its relation to religion. Duncan makes it sound like Bostrom has never thought about the relation between the simulation thought experiment and religion. Of course, Bostrom says this. Apart from the interest this thesis may hold for those who are engaged in futuristic speculation, there are also more purely theoretical rewards. The argument provides a stimulus for formulating some methodological and metaphysical questions, and it suggests naturalistic analogies to certain traditional religious conceptions which some may find amusing or thought-provoking. Although the elements of such a system can be naturalistic, even physical, it is possible to draw some loose analogies with religious conceptions of the world. In some ways, the post-humans running a simulation are like gods in relation to the people inhabiting the simulation. The post-humans created the world we see. They are of superior intelligence. They are omnipotent in the sense that they can interfere in the workings of our world even in ways that violate its physical laws. And they are omniscient in the sense that they can monitor everything that happens. However, all the demigods, except those at the fundamental level of reality, are subject to sanctions by the more powerful gods living at lower levels. Bostrom is well aware of the relation between creation myths and the simulation thought experiment. This does not deter him from his thought experiment because, again, it is not the focus of his paper. His paper is about the likelihood of a simulation within a technological mature society. Reason follows that if it ever becomes possible to create ancestor simulations, there would be many more simulated civilizations than non-simulated civilizations. Then following that, it would be much more likely to be one of the thousands of simulated civilizations rather than the original non-simulated civilization. This is not a hard concept to grasp, and to me it is very interesting. I cannot think of any other premise to add to the three premises given by Bostrom. This fact makes me want to learn more about the theory and Bostrom himself. I'll go as far as to say that to deny that it is a reasonable philosophical thought is to misunderstand the thought experiment altogether. You truly have to go out of your way to not understand the paper in order to make a video like Duncan's. It is full of misconceptions and blatant falsehoods. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more videos on Bostrom and his theories.